It gives me great pleasure to welcome you together with my colleague Donald Lowe to this event here. I'll try to be as brief as I can be and make three very short, very quick points because I know you came here to listen to the speaker. The first point is I just want to reinforce what my colleague Mr. Donald Lowe said about our school. It's quite remarkable how far we have come in 10 years. Some of you may be aware we celebrated our 9th anniversary barely a month ago on the occasion of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's 90th birthday on September 16th. And on that day, as you know, we had a conference on the big ideas of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. But we decided immediately after that, since the 10th year is very special, to have this year-long celebrations. And we have a lot to celebrate. In 9 or 10 years, we are now the third best endowed school of public policy in the world. We have a case not of students chasing scholarships, but of scholarships chasing students. We have therefore, as a result, become the second most generous school of public policy in the world. And also, possibly in some ways, we also have one of the most innovative curriculums of any school of public policy in the world. And of course, I won't give you more data. You can go to our website that Donald pointed to, you get the information. Secondly, I'm going to say a quick word about the topic, and I'm really glad that Lord Adair Turner is here to address this topic of which capitalism for the 21st century, because that's frankly, I think, the defining question of our time. Because we live in a very strange environment. On the one hand, there's a sort of near universal consensus in the world, with the possible exception maybe of North Korea, that the way to progress and go forward is to have a free market economics. We all agree on that. And yet, as a result of this enormous crisis we went through in 2008, 2009, both at the what I call the opinion leader level and the citizen level, there's some fundamental questioning going on as to whether or not capitalism is really working for the benefit of society, for the benefit of people. Incomes are stagnating in many developed societies. So there's a kind of a profound re-questioning going on. What is this all about? And this is why the topic, I think, could not be more timely than it is today. And all this brings me to my third and most important point, which is that, frankly, there could be no better person than Lord Adair Turner to address this subject for us. I'm going to just say, give you a very brief summary of his career, because he said careers in business, public policy, and in academia. And of course, one of the most significant appointments he had recently was that he was made chairman of the UK Financial Services Authority as the financial crisis broke out in September 2008, and therefore had a sort of a ringside view of what was happening in the world at that time. And he also played a leading role in the redesign of the global banking and shadow banking regulations as chairman of the International Financial Stability Board's Major Policy Committee. And as you all know, he's now a senior fellow at the Institute for New Economic Thinking. What's interesting is that before he took on these major roles, he had appointments in many different places. He was the non-executive director at Standard Chartered Bank, where he met Fumi Ha there. He was vice chairman of Merrill Lynch Europe. And from 1995-1999, he was director general of the Confederation of British Industry. He was also at McKinsey and Company from 1982 to 1995. In 2005, he became a crossbench member of the House of Lords. If you're wondering what a crossbench member is, maybe he'll explain to you later. You're neither Labour nor Tory, you're independent, I guess. And he was also appointed chair of the Climate Change Committee in 2008, and stepping down in 2012. He also chaired the Pensions Commission from 2003 to 2006 and the Low Pay Commission from 2002 to 2006. So he's familiar with many of the challenges that Labour has to go through in dealing with this new environment. He's the author of 2 books, and he's coming out, I understand, with a new one this year. And basically what you're going to get today is a preview of the new thinking that he's going to share in his new book. And we're very privileged that he's doing so here with us today. So with that, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Adair. And I think you might have to hear the sound of the things coming down after this. Thank you.
Kishore, thank you very much for that introduction, and it really is a great pleasure to be here at the Lee Kuan Yew School at the beginning of what's going to be a week and a half visit to Singapore, and therefore a great opportunity to interface with people here, with the faculty and students at this school. I've been a great admirer of Kishore for many years, the way that he has thought deeply about the changing nature of our world and the challenges of globalization. It's about some of the challenges, but from a more economic point of view, a more narrowly economic point of view in some sense, that I'm going to talk this evening. I could talk just about the financial crisis, because the financial crisis of 2008 to 9, because that was for me the most fascinating part of my career so far, was dealing with that crisis, and I will cover it in a particular element. It was fascinating because, as Kishore said, I took over in 2008, or very specifically, I took over on the morning of Saturday the 20th, 2008, and Saturday, September the 20th, 2008, and I'm never going to forget that, because it was precisely 1 week after Lehman's had collapsed, 4 days after AIG had collapsed, and indeed my predecessor, Sir Callum McCarthy, rang me the previous Monday the 15th of September, and he said, Adair, what does your contract say about when you're starting? And I said, well, it says I'm starting next Monday, Monday the 22nd of September. And he said, well, could we get that changed? Because I've had a rather challenging weekend dealing with Lehman's, and if things go wrong next weekend, I want that to be your problem, not my problem. So in the course of the week, the Treasury rewrote my contract, and I must be one of very few people in the world who've ever signed a contract which is so precise that it says you will start work at 1 minute past midnight on the morning of Saturday, the 20th of September. It was extraordinary. It was, I have to say, rather like being made captain of the Titanic after you've hit the iceberg, but before you've actually sunk. Because in the subsequent 3 weeks, the entire global financial system seized up. So I am going to touch on the global financial system as one of the 3 points that I'm going to make. But I also want to place that in a far wider perspective and some reflections on the process of economic growth, the process of capitalism, and what we can say and can't say about it. And I want to start by making the point that the last 2 centuries have really seen a remarkable transformation of human life. There's a wonderful economic historian called Angus Maddison who devoted a lot of his life to trying to work out what had happened to human standards of living, not just this year or last year, but looking back over millennia. And what he documented was the extraordinary fact that the last 200 years, really from about 1800 or so, have been exceptional. Because before 1800, broadly speaking, since the creation of agriculture, which is about 8 millennia BC, there were no absolutely fundamental changes in human technology and human standards of living. I mean, broadly speaking, for the vast majority of people in the world, up until about 17 or 1800, economic growth either didn't exist at all or was very slow. If you look at the standard of living of the world in about 1000 AD, as best we can tell, it was roughly equal across the world, and it's absolutely clear that insofar as anybody was ahead, it was China at that time. You can see that slightly ahead, but not dramatically so. Before that, 1,000 years before that, 1,000 years before that, you essentially have a very similar standard of living. You then have a process which lasts many hundreds of years, in which Western Europe and to a degree Japan and other bits of Asia, in particular China, achieve very slow rates of growth. But we're talking about rates of growth of a fraction of a percent a year. Rates of growth where it will take hundreds of years to double standards of living, and therefore when any one generation lives, they fundamentally don't see within that generation itself any appreciable change in standards of living. And then happens the extraordinary breakthrough, which begins with the British Industrial Revolution of the 18th century and various other northwest European countries, in particular Holland, and then slowly spreads in northwest Europe and some of its colonial and emigration offshoots like the US and Canada. You get a revolution. And it's not just a one-off revolution. It appears to bring us through to an entirely new model of human life, in which growth is perpetual, and in which it appears to go on and on, generation after generation. And there are two key drivers of that change. One is a process whereby we continually discover new technologies. We learn new things, we work out new ways to do things, and then we apply that to the economic process. So that we now accept, all of us accept, that every generation or every decade or every year, there will be entirely new products. In a way that nobody assumed that before 1800. Nobody assumed that there was going to be an iPad 3 to follow an iPad 2. This whole idea that there are new things every year is new. So technology is fundamental, and the other is capital accumulation. The process of human beings saving, devoting some of each year's economic activity not to current consumption but to saving and accumulating capital, that is the other absolutely fundamental process of economic growth. And those two elements seem to be assured by the institutions and processes of modern societies. We have institutions, processes, learning, scientific research centers, companies trying to work out how to do things better. All those together seem to make the process of technological progress absolutely assured. And we also seem to have assured processes for running a surplus, accumulating savings, making investments, because we are incented to do so by the fact that we earn rates of return. Now, those processes of economic growth, fundamentally it's technology and capital, can for a time be achieved, and I think we should be clear about this, by planned economies as much as by market economies. So the Soviet Union, in its first 2 or 3 decades of existence, actually was pretty successful in growing technologies and in capital accumulating. But it turned out to be that most planned economies reach a point of atrophy for a complicated set of social and political as much as any other reasons, and that broadly speaking, the system which has tended to ensure that this process goes on and on is a market economy, a capitalist system. That appears to have a set of incentives for efficiency and a set of mechanisms of renewing itself so that we do not hit a buffer of an atrophy such as the Soviet Union increasingly suffered from the 1950s onwards. So we have a set of institutions and mechanisms which appear to ensure two things. Both the continued progress of standards of living among the richest economies of the world, those that are progressing technology at the frontier of technology, and also a set of processes that assure a process of rapid economic catch-up. And one of the interesting things about catch-up process, the speed at which those who, for whatever reason, have fallen behind catch up, that process of catch-up appears to have accelerated greatly over the last 100 years. So that, for instance, if we look at the process of catch-up by which the US or Germany caught up in the late 19th century versus the initial industrial leader, which was Britain, what catch-up meant was that the UK was growing at about 1% per capita per annum, and Germany and US, by copying the technologies of the leader, were able to grow a bit faster at 1.5% to 2% per capita per annum. By the post-war era, we have both an increase in the rate of the leader. The US was growing at something like 2.2% per capita per annum, but other countries, in particular the post-war recovering European economies, but also in particular Korea and Japan, were able to achieve growth rates of per capita per annum of 6 to 7%. Now, in the last 20 years, somewhat of a deceleration of the leader's position, and I'll come back to that later, but in the case of China, we are seeing even more rapid rates of catch-up. And that appears to be because we have a set of mechanisms of global capital flows, global trade flows, global technology flows, which provide a more effective mechanism for transferring technology and capital around the world. Now, the observation of these facts led, before the crisis, to what I will call a very dominant conventional wisdom, which dominated the debates of the last several years. And I think it's reasonable to call that conventional wisdom neoliberal or the Washington Consensus. And it had the following elements. First, a belief that it is obvious what the objective of public policy, and indeed of human life in some sense to be, which is to get richer. That we should try and increase GDP per capita with the assumption that as long as we do that, human welfare, well-being, or even happiness will automatically increase. Secondly, that the best way to achieve that is through free markets in all aspects, free markets for products, free trade, free markets for labor, liberalization of labor markets, and free markets for finance, both domestically and across borders, free capital flows. Thirdly, it was assumed that although that process will inevitably involve inequality, you cannot have markets without significant inequality, that was justified and okay because it helps achieve growth, and that the process of growth, although somewhat unevenly distributed, will in some way help everybody. Everybody will participate in that process of growth. Thirdly, this conventional wisdom was underpinned by a very self-confident academic economics, an economics which had developed over the 30 or 40 years before the crisis, focused very much on the theory of market equilibrium, increasingly mathematically sophisticated, based on the assumption that human beings were essentially rational and that markets were essentially efficient, and establishing, therefore, a strong set of propositions in favor of free markets and market completion. And finally, there was an element of this conventional wisdom that believed that not only would the spread of markets be good for economic growth and also human welfare, but also that this would have political consequences, that the natural concomitant of it would be the spread of democracy, free speech, and that broad set of what one might call Enlightenment ideas, which happened to develop in the 18th century at broadly the same time in which there were the initial stirrings of economic growth. So my question today is, how compelling is that dominant conventional wisdom, that neoliberalism, that Washington consensus? Now, that's a very, very wide topic, and I cannot cover it all. I have covered it somewhat in a book which I produced 2 years ago called Economics After the Crisis, which will address some of these issues, and I will address them further in the book which Kishore mentioned, which will come out next year. But today I'm going to concentrate by making 3 points. Now, they may seem slightly disparate points, and I fear that they are, so it's 3 angles on this issue of how compelling is the neoliberal conventional wisdom. But I hope that I will be able, having addressed it from these 3 different angles, to bring out some common themes. I'm going to make some comments about catch-up and the challenges of catch-up nations. I'm going to make some comments about the problems currently facing the advanced economies and why we face them in terms of finance. And thirdly, I'm going to address the issue of whether rich advanced economies, which of course now includes Singapore as well, face more fundamental questions about whether growth should be the objective and whether growth, perpetual growth, will indeed actually be attainable. So first, some questions on catch-up. The conventional wisdom has seen it as inevitable, provided that countries open their doors to free markets, free trade, free finance. And it has broadly, for the last 20 years, asserted that the more you open your doors to free trade, free finance, free capital flows, and the more you liberalize the economies, the faster the rate of growth you will achieve. But I have to say that as a description of the path actually followed by the most successful catch-up countries, that assumption is, broadly speaking, completely untrue. I think it's important first to realize how few countries have actually so far achieved full catch-up all the way to advanced economy levels. So who has caught up with advanced economy living standards? Well, there are, first of all, some small population, natural resource-rich countries, Qatar. But frankly, the success of Qatar has no implications whatsoever for what China needs to do or what Uganda needs to do in order to be successful. Two other countries have been very successful, but they are small population city-states, entrepôts, trading centres. They're called Singapore and Hong Kong. But I'm going to assert that the success of a relatively small population city-state, though very impressive, actually, again, doesn't tell us much, which is applicable to what you need to do to get to advanced economy standards if you are a large population countries. Beyond those, actually, there are really only 3 large population countries which have so far managed to achieve catch up all the way or close to catch up to advanced economy standards. And those are Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. And beyond those 3, what is striking is how variable and uncertain so far the catch-up process has been. Now, this chart doesn't show GDP per capita, but it shows productivity per hour worked. And what it does is the US through time is indexed at 100 as the flat line across the top, and it shows how successful different countries have been at achieving catch-up. I use this chart in part because it happened to be available, but also because I know it must be absolutely right because I stole it from Tharman Shanmugaratnam, so it is by definition correct. And what this chart shows is that actually the process of catch-up has been very imperfect. If you look at the right, at Latin America, the fact is that Latin America for 30 years has not managed overall to achieve catch-up. Some of the rates of growth of GDP per capita are a bit faster than these productivity growth rates because there's been an increase in labor force participation. But broadly speaking, much of Latin America does seem to have been stuck, at least for the last 30 or 40 years, maybe it's changing now, in something of a middle-income trap. As for much of Southeast Asia and South Asia, well, it's in many ways doing better, but it's still not proven that it can achieve success all the way. The most successful of those countries shown there is the purple line on top, which is Malaysia. The interesting one, of course, is that Chinese red line really shooting up over the last 20 years. I know that Kishore is a great optimist about the catch-up process of Southeast Asia, and I, broadly speaking, share that optimism. But I would simply say that if we are looking for where to look for the models that definitively work, you have to return to the 3 I mentioned earlier, to Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. And what do we know about Japan, Korea, and Taiwan? Well, we know that they broke pretty much every rule of the Washington Neoliberal Consensus. They used an export orientation. They used the challenge of having to export to the rest of the world. They used internal competition, but they also used trade tariffs. They were not, in their initial stages, free marketeers. They had a role for the state. They had an element of picking winners. Indeed, if you look at the great transformation of South Korea in 1960s to 70s under Park Chung-hee, he was quite explicitly an admirer not of British free trade economics, but of a German economist called Friedrich List, who had set out an argument based upon German economics in the 19th century of a role of the state in helping the catch-up process. And all of these countries, these three countries, used a significant element of what is called financial repression rather than liberalization, and they used that in order to achieve a focus of capital towards industrial investment. There are 2 points I want to stress about successful economic development models, which are outside what the Washington Consensus tells us. The first is the fundamental importance of capital investment, and I simply want to make the point that you can use a credit system essentially to achieve forced savings. Both Friedrich Hayek and Joseph Schumpeter pointed this out, that you can essentially, by allocating credit to industry through a financial system, achieve a higher level of capital investment, a higher level of savings, as Friedrich Hayek put it, than people would freely choose for themselves, and that for a period of time that can be a very effective way of achieving rapid growth. And both Japan and Korea used financial repression models of development. And indeed, if you were to try and understand the pace of growth of China today, that is not based upon the Washington Consensus model. It is based upon a significant role for state-owned enterprises which have significant access, favorable access to credit, which are achieving a very rapid growth rate of investment, probably far higher than would be freely chosen by the sort of free agent consumers which are beloved of neoclassical economic theory. The other point I want to make is about demographics. The Washington Consensus, indeed an awful lot of modern economics, doesn't really talk about demographics, but I think it is fundamental. Unless you have a slowdown in the rate of population growth, it is very difficult to achieve the capital deepening from which rapid growth is achieved. I fear that around the world today, the word demographic dividend is hugely misused. I go to countries that tell me we've got a demographic dividend because we've got this huge number of young people under the age of 15. And I have to say, I think in some countries of Africa, that isn't a demographic dividend, that is a demographic problem. My own analysis, which I set out in a lecture I gave for the Royal Society in the UK some years ago, is that reductions in fertility are not just the byproduct of growth, but are a crucial driver for it. Because a lower rate of fertility, of course, it creates some long-term problems that you have to deal with, but you may be able to deal with those once you're already a rich country. It enables two things. It helps you achieve a high savings rate, because people are not having to support large numbers of children. But crucially, it means that each new generation receives by its inheritance a higher capital stock per person. The process of deepening is fundamental, and I deliberately try to stir things up in lectures. This may be less controversial here than in some other places in the world. I think that the fact that most of us rightly have some ethical concerns about the Chinese one-child policy should not blind us to the fact that that has almost certainly been a positive factor for the rapid economic takeoff in China. And as I look around the world, therefore, and look at whether other countries are going to achieve successful economic growth, I think many will, and we talk very confidently at the moment about the breakthrough occurring in Africa. I simply throw it as my final point on the catch-up, a worry that the sheer rates of population growth which are occurring in some countries like Uganda or Niger, and have a look at those figures from Niger, from 2.6 million in 1950 to 70 million forecast by 2050, creates a pace of growth which makes it almost impossible to get ahead of the capital deepening process. Yes, 19th century British growth involved a significant increase in population, but let's be clear that what is going on in places like Africa is on a different scale entirely. Britain in the 19th century grew its population from about 12 million to 40 million, an increase of about 3 times. Uganda, over 100 years, is increasing its population 20 times. That is fundamental. So what are my conclusions on catch-up? They are the following. Yes, global trade and investment and ideas flows are very important. You have to be open to the world, and they have increased the achievable pace of growth. But any idea that there is a model of economic growth, of a total liberalization of markets, which is sufficient or certain or a necessary model of economic development is not true. Thirdly, that the processes of rapid capital accumulation are absolutely vital and may, in some cases, benefit from the suppression of free financial markets in a way which directly contradicts the creed of neoliberalism. And fourth, that there are some other features, as it were, tangential, orthogonal to the dominant theory, such as demographics, which are not well captured by modern theory, but can be fundamental. My second topic is the cyclical challenge now facing the rich developed world in advanced economies and the role of finance. And I'm going to cover this very briefly for 2 reasons. First, in the interest of time, and secondly, I'm an author, and I need to leave you with an incentive to buy my book. So I'm not going to give it all away. You know, there has to be something hidden, you know, and here it is, Economics After the Crisis, and there'll be another book next year. So, what am I going to say about finance and the cycle in the rich developed world? My first point is that I want to stress the scale of the setback which has occurred. I mentioned earlier Angus Maddison and his long-range figures of economic growth. For the UK, he actually puts together, and I think that's the best shot at it, figures for GDP per capita each year from 1830. And what is interesting there is you can look at how economic growth has been remarkably continuous. And one test of that is, if you look at every decade, every combination of 10 years that you can have, in pretty much every combination of 10 years, you get growth in GDP per capita. You have some cycles, but pretty much by the time you stretch it over 10 years, you're ahead. There are 3 exceptions. 1, a set of combinations that go across the First World War, 2, the Second World War, and 3, a period in the late 19th century, 1895 to 1905, where we actually had a very rapid rate of population growth. There's only one peacetime set of 10 years where this process of economic growth didn't deliver an increase in GDP per capita. Well, in the UK, 2007 to 2017 is likely to be another decade. We may have another entire decade in which we do not have an increase in GDP per capita. And in other countries, we see equally extraordinary effects. In the US, the level of GDP per capita will rise over those 10 years, but it will be in 2017 something like 15% or so below where it would have been if the pre-crisis trend had been continued. So it appears that our model has broken down, that the inevitability of growth via technology, capital accumulation, and the application of markets has suffered a setback. Now, why is that the case? Is it something long-term going on in these advanced economies, or is it just the financial crisis and its aftermath? Well, I'm going to come back in section 3 to whether there are some long-term trends at work. But I think it's clear that a very major element is cyclical. And it's also clear that this setback has been the result of things that went wrong in the financial system itself. And that is different from the setbacks to the advanced economies which occurred, for instance, in the 1970s. I studied economics at Cambridge in the 1970s. We were then suffering from what was called stagflation, simultaneous high unemployment and high inflation. And it was quite clear that the problems we then faced had quite a lot to do with our labor markets, with over-powerful trade unions, with inflationary wage claims, with too high public deficits, with public expenditure out of control. Those were not, except in one or two countries like Greece, the real causes of this crisis. This crisis, the crisis of 2007-2008, fundamentally arose within a financial system whose growth in intensity, whose innovations, whose remarkable skilled people had been lauded to the skies as being the basis of relentlessly improving economic growth. And the reason it went wrong, I believe, is that the propositions in favor of free markets, which I think are pretty good in the market for restaurants. I mean, if you want good restaurants, we can't do much more than let 1,000 flowers bloom. Some will survive, some not. Entrepreneurship works. The customer can work out what they want. And if you doubt that, you've never had the joy of visiting a restaurant in the Soviet Union before the fall of the Berlin Wall. But those propositions, which are pretty compelling in the market for restaurants, the market for cars, the market for hotels, they work much less well in the market for finance. And in particular, I want to assert that a free market financial system will have a systematic tendency to produce too much of the wrong sort of credit. My fundamental proposition is that let's look at this remarkable growth of financial intensity over the several decades before the crisis. These are a series of different measures of financial intensity. The creation of a complicated set in the top right of securities, the originate and distribute shadow banking system, the dramatic increase in trading volumes down in the bottom right, foreign exchange volumes growing far faster than foreign trade, the growth of derivatives. All of those created problems. All of them suffer from the fact that financial markets, unlike described in much modern neoclassical economics, are not always driven by rationality and can be subject to overshoots and irrationality which produce volatility in the real economy. But the point is that as long as that volatility is in the market for equities, it doesn't necessarily cause too much harm. If we look at the NASDAQ, it went from 1,500 in 1997 to 5,000 in late 2000, back to 1,500 in 2002. And there was a lot of waste resulted of that. A lot of young people came out of university, set up internet websites which never had a penny of revenue, let alone a penny of profit. There was quite a lot of wasted resource which disappeared. But that may be just part of the Schumpeterian process described by Schumpeter of creation and creation destruction, which is part of the growth process. And when it occurs in the market for equity, it is irrational, it's not as described by efficient markets, but it doesn't necessarily make a mess of the economy. The problems come from the increase of debt contracts, which you can see on the top left-hand side, or to show it in another way, the extraordinary growth of private debt in the US, going from 70% of GDP in 1945 and ending up at over 200% in 2008. Now I'm going to skip over the next several slides because I want to move on to my third subject. But essentially what I am saying is that financial markets are subject to irrationality, that credit markets, as I have argued earlier, can be very effective ways at an early stage of economic growth of allocating investment to capital investment and growth, but that we have to understand that the free market is capable of producing too much credit and, crucially, the wrong type of credit. If you pick up almost any undergraduate textbook or graduate textbook of economics or even the advanced theory and say, what does it say the banking system does and what are credit contracts for, I assure you, because I've had a researcher checking this for me all summer, it broadly says the following. It says, households deposits money into banks which lend money to companies to do capital investments. That's how we describe in economics what the banking system does. Well, my best calculation is that modern banking systems do that about 15% of the time, and the other 85% of the time they do other categories of credit. They do, in addition to credit to finance real investment projects, they do loans to finance the purchase of existing assets, in particular existing real estate assets. They do mortgage loans to households to finance residential homes, which in advanced economies usually means not new construction, but existing homes. Or they do loans to impatient or temporarily cash-limited poor households to bring forward consumption. And the crucial point is that each of those forms of credit may perform an useful economic function, but broadly speaking, apart from the first, they're not fundamental to the process of growth. And if there are too much of the other categories, they can destabilize the economy. And that is leading to an increasing body of analysis which suggests that if you try and understand the relationship between private credit to GDP and successful economic growth, it is probably not, as we assumed before the crisis, a linear and limitless relationship. More credit deepening is limitlessly good. It is probably what we call an inverse U, a relationship where up to a point more credit is good, but beyond that it is bad. And that may even, and this is taken from a very interesting paper by Steve Cicchetti, the present chief economist at the Bank for International Settlements, it may also, they suggest that beyond a certain point, we can have too much finance. That beyond a certain point, the financialization of our economy and the financial sector share of employment might be bad for growth. So what follows from all that is simply that we need to challenge the pre-crisis neoliberal assumption that more finance is necessarily good because it achieves a more efficient allocation of resources and a more efficient management of risk. My third subject focuses on a still more fundamental issue. We tend to assume that the breakthrough of the last 200 years is permanent, and that having moved from that era of slow or no growth to one of continual growth and transforming standards of living each generation, that will always be the case. And we tend to assume that as long as we have economic growth, that necessarily means better lives, higher quality of life, and indeed greater happiness. But more recently, in the countries which have the privilege of being rich already and therefore can debate these issues, those assumptions have been increasingly challenged. The first challenge has been made by Robert Gordon of Northwestern University, and he has pointed out that while it's true that since the breakthrough of the 18th and 19th century, growth of the leading nations, the nations at the frontier of technology, has been continuous, it has not been always at the same rate of growth. Broadly speaking, in the 19th century, yes, Britain had got through an industrial revolution, had got on a path of continuous growth, but we're talking 0.75%, 1%, 1.5% type growth rates, 1% over the whole of the century during that period. What then happens in the early and mid-20th century is the great acceleration. You get an acceleration of productivity and GDP per capita, and the glory years are the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, and 60s. And Gordon argues that since then, there has been a significant slowdown in that rate of growth. And the hypothesis of what has occurred is the following: that yes, we have processes for continually searching for new ideas and new technologies, but that what is available to be discovered inherently might differ in importance over time. and that we had available to discover 100 years ago a set of technology improvements which really were fundamental. That when we basically took energy primarily from fossil fuels and applied it through the electromechanical and electrical revolution to producing cars and railways and ships and aeroplanes and automated factories, that process of automating those functions and using energy as well as human effort to those functions was transformational, and that fundamentally, once you've done that transformation, there isn't something equally transformational again. We know how, in rich developed societies, to wake up each morning and, on average, if people want, to work 35 hours a week, and everybody to have enough to eat, lighting, heating, a car, travel. We know how to do that, and once you've done it, the argument is, actually, although we progress things, it's not as fundamental. Gordon indeed takes it a step further. He says, and this is one of those great conjectures which of course we won't have to test him to, because he's running out through to 2100 and I think he's 70-year-olds already, so a bet with Robert isn't going to work. But he argues that this is so fundamental that you can imagine that the 21st century will see a fundamental slowdown. Now, he and other people suggest this is a major challenge. What are we going to do about this fundamentally lower rate of growth? But then there's another school of thought that says, well, don't worry about it, because beyond some certain level of GDP per capita, getting yet more GDP per capita just isn't all that important to human welfare. And some of you may have seen these figures before. If you take income per head along the horizontal axis, and these various survey measures of whether people feel happy, whether they feel their life is satisfied, whether they feel that they have well-being in their life, broadly speaking, what it tends to show is a big relationship between going from $2,000 a year to $10,000 or $15,000 a year, but a point beyond which it's simply not as transformational as it previously was. So we have an idea that there may be just less important technologies than before, and we have an idea that it may not be a terrible challenge, it may be okay. And in a sense, you can bring those together in Robert Gordon's great challenge, the question that he poses to you. Which of the following two do you want? Option A, you get to keep all the innovations of the last 15 years. You get your iPads, you get your mobile phones, you get the internet, but sorry, you've got to give up running water and piped sewage. Option B, the other way round. Now, most people go for option B, and particular in the emerging markets who still know something about this, pretty much all women go for option B because they were the people who used to spend many hours a day doing nothing other than shipping water around. So that is the proposition that there is something fundamental about the change which we went through over the last 200 years which will never be repeated and doesn't need to be repeated. Well, I think you can have different points of view on those arguments, but the crucial point I want to make about the nature of economics, I think, is that it's important to realize that quite separate from the economic system that we choose, free markets or not, there may be something about technological possibility which is exogenous, which is a given, which is fundamental, and which changes over time. That there are economic impacts of the initial creation and application of electricity which are different from the creation of the application of ICT. And it may also be the case, and this is the final point I'm going to come to, that technologies may have very different implications for inequality, and that we may be on the verge of new technologies which, left to themselves, will actually make the future distribution of the fruits of technological process extremely unequally divided. Let me ask you, first of all, to think about those technologies of the electromechanical revolution. So we're talking here about the internal combustion engine, we're talking about tractors in the fields in agriculture and threshing machines and the automation of agriculture. We're talking about the creation of the car, and we're talking about the whole of household appliances, washing machines, all of that sort of stuff. Those technologies destroyed huge numbers of jobs because they fundamentally destroyed jobs in agriculture. We used to live in societies where 60 or 70% of all people fundamentally had to do agriculture, and in advanced economies today, that is now, on average across all the advanced economies, we only need to employ about 2 or 3% of our population in agriculture to make all the food we want. So they destroyed a lot of jobs by automating it, but they also created huge numbers of jobs because there was something inherent about making all those cars that everybody needed, which required a lot of people, and making those appliances and running those transportation networks. So actually the application of that technology was pretty good for the unskilled or the moderately skilled working class operative. And the glory days, in a sense, of semi-skilled or skilled labor was perhaps the US automotive industry of the 1950s. There was a lot of use of energy, there was a degree of automation, but you also need large amounts of labor. Now I'd like you to consider, first of all, a hypothetical technology, and then we'll make it a little bit real. Suppose 15 years ago, 20 years ago, before there were mobile phones, somebody had turned up and say, I have discovered this amazing piece of magic. You say, abracadabra, 1, 2, 3, and you can talk to whoever you want at the end of the world. You say, abracadabra, 1, 2, 3, I'm in London, and I say, abracadabra, 1, 2, 3, Kishore, and I'm talking to Kishore, right? Suppose that had occurred. What would that mean economically? Well, it would be tremendously valuable. It would be, hugely useful to be able to do that. But as I've set it out, it wouldn't be in the GDP figures at all. It would just be a free benefit we all had. And actually, nobody would make any money out of it because I just told you what the secret was. Now let's go a little bit and make this a little less extreme. Suppose the chap who said, I've got this abracadabra 1, 2, 3, says, I'm only going to tell you it if you pay me for my patent. They'd be the richest person in the world because they'd charge a minute amount to everybody who wanted to use it. And suppose in order to make it work, we needed to put a relatively small amount of labor into building some masts and laying some fiber. The companies who put that in the ground or who knew the technology to make that work, they'd be very rich as well. Now my point is, modern information and communications technology is not absolutely a magic abracadabra. But compared with the technologies of the electromechanical revolution, it is much closer to it. It is something where the creation by very clever people of a piece of software can create something which, once you've got it, you can replicate 100 million times at close to zero marginal cost. A Model T Ford, once Henry Ford had designed it, it still cost quite a lot of labor to produce unit number 2 and number 3 and number 4 and unit number 10 million. Once you've got Microsoft Office, the 10 millionth copy costs essentially nothing. It's just a copy. This is an extraordinary technology, and the technologies of the internet are extraordinary, and one of the implications of this is they actually employ remarkably few people. We sometimes say, where are the jobs going to come from in the future? And we say, they're all going to be in information and communications technology. Well, I'd just like you to note how extraordinarily few jobs are created by modern software companies, which are hugely important and have helped transform our world. Microsoft, remember Walmart, retailer, now employs close to 2 million people worldwide. Microsoft, 90,000, Amazon, 50,000, Google, 30,000, Facebook, 4,000, and I think I'm right that when Facebook bought Instagram for $1 billion, it had 11 employees. This is the remarkable thing about information and communication technology is it's a hugely powerful technology, essentially because it's software-based, ideas-based, and that means that it can create great consumer value, but it doesn't create many jobs. And that may mean that is a technology which has a huge and inherent tendency to inequality, that the side effects, the distribution of this will be hugely unequally divided. That unlike the previous revolution of the electromechanical revolution, it won't automatically create new jobs. Now, of course, if you believe in free labor markets, and broadly speaking I do, I believe new jobs will come, and they may be very intensive in the service sectors of the economy, but I also think that the equilibrium relative real wage dispersion, which is required for full employment, may increase. And may increase because of something inherent within the technologies, quite independent of the technology choices we made. How to pull together all the points of view in my third subject, well, just a sort of broad thought. We went through this process of economic and technological process. And it's quite clear, I think, that in the early stages of that, as you're going from African standards of living to Chinese standards of living to French standards of living or British standards of living, that is transformational for human welfare. It may be the case that that transformation in human welfare is just as good as it gets, that it doesn't get better than that, and that beyond a certain level, there is nothing quite so fundamental in terms of human welfare, but also that there are problems of inequality that we have to manage. Finally then, what are the implications of this for the case for capitalism? I said earlier that the three elements of the Washington Consensus, neoliberalism, modern academic neoclassical economics, was an assumption that the objective is growth, that it's permanently possible at roughly the same rate at the frontier as long as you have good policy, and that it's sure to translate into human welfare. Secondly, that the objectives are best delivered and are assuredly delivered by as free markets as possible, including free markets in finance. And thirdly, that while inequality is the inevitable result, other people, all people, will benefit because growth will benefit all. And I failed to say earlier, just on that issue of inequality, that of course that hypothesis about the potential impact of ICT is borne out by the really extraordinary phenomenon that over the last 25 years, the lowest quartile of the US population in that growing rich economy have received no increases in real wage at all, and that phenomenon now seems to be spreading from the bottom quartile to the midden quartiles to medium earners as well. So basically the objective is growth. The objective of growth is delivered by free markets. Inequality will result, but we don't need to worry too much about it because growth will benefit all. Well, I believe, in contradiction to that catch-up development is not always delivered by a totally free market approach and is not always assured, but can be influenced by fundamentals such as demography. That finance in particular is a particular area of free markets where we can overdo liberalization and we can have too much finance, which can itself, under some circumstances, threaten growth. And thirdly, I believe that there may be inherent technological factors which influence the rate of growth and the rate of inequality almost independent of the policy, and which no easy set of policies will overcome. And all of that implies that what we need in applying market economics to societies is frankly a more nuanced debate about their benefits, their disadvantages, where those disadvantages are self-inflicted and where they are inherent, and where we need a space for political debates about what we need, rather than reducing economics to a mechanical process where we assume that we know what we want. We need, therefore, a more humble economics and a more political economics, and not the extreme version of neoclassical economics, which I think was too simplistic in its understanding of objectives and results, and too simplistic and mechanistic in its understanding of tools. Finally, however, even though I say all that, I still think it is important to realize that there is a case for the market economy and for capitalism which really has nothing to do with growth at all. I think we have constructed an over-instrumental case for market economy and economic freedom. And Amartya Sen, in one of his books, put this well. He says, let us suppose that contrary to our dominant economic theories and apparent empirical practice, it would have been possible to have a Soviet-style planned economy and achieve the same rate of growth. Would that have been a good thing? And he says no, because the freedom to choose to set up a business, to create, to come up with ideas, the freedom to choose where you want to allocate your labor, to the freedom to explore new ideas, these are ends in themselves, irrespective of the instrumental objective of higher rates of growth. And so even if it is the case that this is the nature of the relationship, I think there will be a case for freedom, for free market, for economic freedom, but it will be one which relates to the case for the enlightened values of social and political freedom, rather than one which we construct entirely on the basis of what I think pre-crisis was an oversimplistic set of economic propositions. Thank you very much.
And I'm going to just focus my question on just one of the sectors you picked on there, the finance sector, and about the enormous growth that you showed. And this is, of course, a question coming from a layman who doesn't understand many of the sophistication of modern finance. But it struck me that one reason why we had this huge crisis in 2008, 2009 is that we created incentives for the bankers to go and leverage to the hilt. I mean, they leveraged many more times than anybody else ever did. And they could do so with great confidence because they thought at the end of the day, if anything goes wrong, the state will come in and rescue us. So you, in a sense, the bankers got the incentive to privatize the profits and to socialize the losses, as they put it. Now, was there something fundamentally wrong with that layman's analysis of what went wrong?
Well, I think that is part of the analysis. I don't think it's the whole of the analysis. I think it is very important that we did create a set of perverse incentives in the financial system. We created it, let's take in trading rooms. You know, we were at the end of 2006, 2007 in the trading rooms of the world, rewarding people with large, immediate, non-returnable cash bonuses for trading profits that looked good at that point, without checking that this hadn't left a trail of toxic waste, which was going to become apparent over the next few years. So we have addressed that incentive system within the global financial regulatory regime by increasingly demanding of firms that when they pay bonuses, they pay in equity or subordinated debt, they defer it for several years, and if things go bad thereafter, they can claw it back. And I think that is a better system. I think you're also right, Kishore, that we had created a set of implicit incentives, which was the private benefits, socialized losses, where you leveraged up because you would get the benefits of high leverage, and if it turned out bad, the state would bail you out. And I think it's very important that we fix that, and that is covered by both the significant increases in capital that we have required within the Basel III capital regimes on banks, very significant increases in equity capital, and what is called the resolution reforms, regime reforms, so that even if the capital is exhausted, banks have what is called bail-inable debt, so that some of the private debt holders take a loss to recapitalize the firms rather than the shareholders, rather than the taxpayer taking a loss. So I think those reforms are very important, but I'm also wary of just focusing on those incentives and just imagining that this was a group of cynical guys sitting there saying, we better leverage up, we're going to walk over with the good stuff. These people who are in the banks, and this is inherent to financial markets, this is inherent to human nature as understood by a true understanding of human nature rather than the rational economic man who populates economic models. The investment bankers who did these huge bets were not cynically thinking that they were simply exploiting an asymmetry in the incentives. They believed they were doing the right things. And the giveaway is lots of these guys in 2007 had large amounts of equity in their own firms. I mean, if you look at Dick Fuld, chief executive of Lehman's, he had enormous amounts of Lehman stock. He wasn't sitting there saying, this is, I'm doing a cynical thing which is going to blow up and I'll get out just in time. He believed his own rhetoric. And this is the nature of human beings. They get carried away with these stories that this time it's different, that we've discovered some brand new technology of risk management, which means we can take risks that people couldn't take before. So you have to bring in that side as well. The incentives matter. We have to shift the risks. We have to deal with the risks through the incentives. But we also have to understand that any financial system will be subject to surges of irrational exuberance, of excess credit extension, excess asset prices, which will produce crashes. And that, I believe, requires another element of policy, which I believe requires the discretionary power of central banks and regulators to lean against asset price and credit cycles when they see them coming. I didn't mention that as I went through, but that is the implication of that point of view that I set out about the irrational creation of credit, which I set out in section 2.
Just a quick follow-up question, then I'll come to you. It is also a fact that, immediately after the crisis, after they were bailed out, and it was shown that society bailed them out, as soon as they felt things are back to normal, they immediately went back to paying themselves huge bonuses. And that was, as you know, caused a huge outcry among the man in the street saying, what's going on here? What was their thinking at that point in time? How did they justify paying themselves such huge bonuses immediately after almost wrecking their societies?
Well, broadly speaking, I'm sympathetic with your point of view that some of them had, let us call it,
I'm trying to get him into trouble.
a tin ear for the social acceptability. They had a tin ear for public response and anger at what had occurred. If I could make the case at all from the other side, there were, of course, some banks which were not part of the crisis, which ran themselves well, and some of those, and those include some Western banks with large franchises here in Asia, were saying, well, hang on, we weren't part of the crisis. In fact, in September 2008, you, the regulators and central banks, were encouraging us to lend money to the guys who were in trouble, rather than the other way around. And also, we don't just operate in the UK and the US. We also operate, in Singapore, in Hong Kong, in China. And, there's still a very, frothy market for good bank executives. And I attach, and we've got to compete in that market. Now, what you then get, of course, is the guys back at home who were part of the problem say, well, yeah, we've got to compete with those guys. So you get a chain of justification. I think it is the case. I put forward an argument for being very cautious of the pre-crisis ideas that more finance is limitlessly good, that in particular more credit is limitlessly good. I think we were guilty of simplicities in our understanding, and I think we ended up paying large amounts of money for some activities which, to use a phrase for which I got some fame or infamy, depending on who you listen to, activities which were socially useless. But however we better regulate it and control it, finance will still be a big and complex and important part of a market economy. And I don't want to go so far as to suggest that. And it will require complex management, and they will be paid, amounts comparable with what is paid at the top of, other equally complex companies. So you need that balance. But the balance got completely out of reasonable social optimality in the years before the crisis, particularly in the major European and US markets.
Great. We're past 6:30, but let's take one or two quick questions, if you don't mind. One over there, one over there. We'll take it to the two questions together, and then we can finish them. Please go ahead.
We have noted that the ratio of financial assets to real GDP After the second wave, which is 100%, and now it's risen to 350%, and it's raising very rapidly under this quantitative easing and government deficit. Now, in your presentation about the inverse yield curve, I would like to know that based on your experience, what is your thinking about at what peak level is the gross, the financial sector asset to GDP ratio that you think that might precipitate a crisis? Thank you.
Okay, good question. Next one, please.
I'm curious what your view is on the following matter. So this relates to the points you made near the end of your presentation. So I completely agree with you in that low growth and low employment is a high possibility because of the structural change and the nature of the industry that is emphasized. But then what becomes important is the financial channeling from the bread earner to the rest of the society. And then if you would like to if you were to compare the West and East, the East, where in the West there are better established foundations and donation culture and social welfare, whereas in the East there's better, more compact family organization where they're willing to help each other and share their finances. Which model do you think will be more?
So is the West better or East better?
Do you have a point of that on Kishore?
One last quick question, anybody? Okay, over there, please. And then we'll answer all three and then we'll conclude. Yes, please.
I have a very generic question going back from financial crisis back to the history of 200 years you've explained so nicely in 1 hour time. Over the last 10, 12 years, starting from the Enron crisis to Lehman Brothers collapse, we have seen that at the same time the government has increased regulations after each crisis and stepped into the market economy. And we have been actually talking about the capitalism and connecting capitalism often with the democracy and free market, and where if I connect capitalism with free market and against the role of state, then probably we are looking in capitalism less role of state. But at any point in any country over the last few decades have role of both institutions, free market and government, hand in hand. And which level of free market and the government is optimum probably will depend on the demographic and cultural issues of the individual countries and stages of development they are going through. And although there is an intellectual obsession or ideological obsession for capitalism and free market, we often tend to not to recognize the role of state, which actually plays a very important role in supporting and promoting capitalism. Even Singapore or China could be very interesting cases to look at that. So in that case, can we look at capitalism in a way where actually we tend to recognize these roles of state in capitalism in future? Yeah,
three profound questions.
Three profound questions. Let me try quick.
Now we want three profound answers.
We'll try. I'll try. Well, the first one, I'll try and give a profound answer, but I will also evade the demand for what is the level X. Because you asked a very difficult question. You said, okay, I'm proposing that there may be some inverse U in relation to the amount of credit within the economy. Now, I didn't set out the arguments in detail. They are set out in the book. They're also set out in a lecture I gave at the Stockholm School of Economics in real detail 3 weeks ago, which, just as a comment on modern economics, was called Credit, Money and Leverage, What Wicksell, Hayek and Fisher Knew and Modern Macroeconomics Forgot, because there's actually fantastic analysis of the role of credit within our economies in writers like Knut Wicksell, Friedrich von Hayek, Irving Fisher, writers of the early 20th century. So I am asserting that when we think about credit, it is undoubtedly true, and a lot of the economic development literature suggests that, if you took India in 1970, and I think the figure for credit to GDP was about 10%, the process of India growing was assisted and needed to be assisted by 10% debt to GDP turning into 30% 30, 40% debt to GDP. There are a role for debt contracts which enable the mobilization of savings, which will not occur if we tried to make every contract an equity contract. But I'm asserting that beyond some point we can have too much credit, and in particular too much credit of a particular form. Now, you have then asked me, okay, that's very fine, but what's the figure? Is it 73%? Is it 82%? At what level do we say too much credit? And the answer is, I don't know, and I don't think we will actually have a definitive figure. And one of the reasons why I'm cautious of providing a figure, you may know that in the area of public debt, there was an attempt to say what the figure was in Carmen Reinhardt and Ken Rovock's book, and they said it's 90%. Beyond 90% debt to GDP, you're bound to have problems. And they've now had a big debate about whether the statistics can actually support any such figure. And I think it's very difficult to have a figure. But I certainly think that when you see a country like the UK, which went from 15% household debt to GDP in 1964 to 95% household debt to GDP in 2008, you are asking for problems. Because if you then have a crisis and asset values fall, those people with that high level of debt will then be terrified by their high level of debt, and they will cut their consumption, and businesses will cut their investment, and you will move into a deflationary, deleveraging cycle, which is the fundamental problem that the rich developed world is in today. So somewhere, as you get up towards 100%, if you want a figure, get worried. And there's very good work. Steve Cicetti's work has been done on this. I think there's some excellent work also being done by a team at University College Davis, University of California at Davis, Alan Taylor, Morris Schullerich, and Oscar Yorda, and they are precisely looking at some of these long-term trends and what we can say, and I think it's a very important area of economics. The only thing I will add to this is, if that is true, if there is a level of credit, GDP, beyond which you might have problems, then some of the emerging markets need to look carefully about whether they are not on the route to create the same problems that we in the advanced economies have had. Chinese total social finance, credit to GDP as they call it, total social finance, has shot up from about 130% of GDP to over 200% in the last 5 years with the stimulus programs. And there's a lot of interesting work. There was a chart which I skipped over which shows that throughout the emerging markets, including in Southeast Asia, there appears to be an interesting phenomenon of what some people call the increasing credit intensity of growth. That for every unit of growth, we seem to need to pump in even more units of credit. I think that is concerning and something that needs to be watched carefully. The second and third points were somewhat related, and they were about the role of the state, about social welfare nets, and more generally the role of the state. What can we say? If in rich advanced economies we might have lower growth, creating higher wage jobs might be difficult, we might have more inequality, what then do we do about that? Now, some people say, oh, well, the thing to do is to train people up, to educate people. It's all about skills. And I am passionately in favor of people being more educated and people having higher skills. But I'm afraid I think as an answer to the problem of growing inequality, it is probably facile. It's too easy. I think we are unlikely to be able to increase the wage rate of the person who cleans our houses or cleans our offices simply by giving them more skills. And I think there's something about the modern economy which tends to have a very strong winner-take-all effect, that it provides very strong returns to the person who is relatively slightly better than the other person, even if the other person could have done the job at a reasonable level of adequacy. It's a very complicated thing to do with labour markets. And therefore, I don't think that we can get away from the fact that if we do care about inequality, and some people do care about inequality, and I do, you need to talk about a basic social welfare net, which is to a degree redistributive, which is fundamentally taking some of the incomes of the higher income people and making sure that there is a basic level of good social goods and services for all people in a society in order to create a sense of inclusiveness. And by the way, I think that is important for equality of opportunity. I think the idea that we can completely decouple equality of opportunity from the distribution of results is a delusion. I think a highly unequal society will also be a non-meritocratic society. Again, you can debate that, but I think that is the case. What that implies, however, is that if states are to provide good basic welfare nets, they also need to make sure that they target those sufficiently. And sometimes that means reforming them the other way. Kishore mentioned earlier that I was in charge of a commission in the UK on the reform of our pension system. We actually recommended that we should have a slightly more generous state pension than we currently do in order to make sure that we weren't interfering for incentives for private savings by means testing our basic state pension. But we also recommended that you should get that at a greater age. We recommended that the state pension age should go up from 65 to 68. And I remember that on the morning, 11 o'clock on the morning of November the 30th, 2005, when I remade those recommendations, up until that point, not a single British political party had mentioned the possibility of increasing the state pension age. And in talking to me, they said, well, could you say it? It was rather like a captain in the trenches of the First World War saying to the troops, would you like to go first as you head towards the machine guns? I said it at 11 o'clock in the morning, and by the 7 o'clock news in the evening, all three political parties were committed to increasing the state pension age. You have to do that. We are having got increasing longevity. People are living longer, and they are also living longer, healthier ages. Sticking your state pension ages at too low a level and not increasing them is simply using up resources that we need in order to make sure that we have good social welfare nets. And it means that in these debates about good social welfare nets, you sometimes get people arguing, oh, well, the last thing you need is an increase in state pension age. You need that alongside making sure that when people do get their pension, we've looked after them adequately well. Now, the final point was a more general point about the role of the state. What is the role of the state in a free market economy? I think there is a very important role in regulating and constraining finance. I believe that finance is different. I believe it's important. I think it should fundamentally be organized in most functions on a free market basis. I don't believe in nationalizing banks, though there is a role for long-term development banks. But I think it needs to be managed in a macroeconomic sense by a combination of central banks and financial regulation, and that we cannot manage this process simply as we deluded ourselves before the crisis by saying that all that central banks have to do is address one objective, which is low and stable inflation, achieved by one policy tool, which is the interest rate. I think we need to deploy a set of what are called macroprudential tools, countercyclical capital, loan-to-value limits in real estate finance, in order to manage those credit cycles and stop them running out of control and hurting the economy. So we need regulation of the financial system as a special case. We need basic social welfare nets. There is a function, a social function of making sure that capitalism has an adequately a widespread distribution of results. And I think back in the 1950s, we happened to go through a particular technological conjuncture where that occurred somewhat naturally in a free market sense, because the free market distribution of relative real wages happened to mean that the skilled worker was highly paid. You cannot assume that that was always the case. The state has to help make that happen. Finally, I don't think we should entirely ignore the role of the state in innovation. If you look at where these wonderful things of the internet came from, and the devices, the software and the hardware, a lot of it, the absolutely basic hard science, was not private. It was done by the American Defense Department
You're not saying that Al Gore invented the internet.
No, I'm not saying Al Gore did, because I don't think he was at the Defense Department in the 1950s. But if you look at, there's a very good book by a man called Bill Janaway, and Bill knows what he's talking about, because he made a lot of money in Warburg Pincus as an investor in the new economy, but he's also an economic historian, and he has pointed out that those who've made money out of the new economy should not delude themselves that this was just the brilliance of venture capital and people in garages. It built on a baseload of raw science research, which would never have been done except by state investment. And equally, some of the things which are being now achieved in biotechs were crucially important in their basic science in the investment of the American Department of Health. I stress America simply because the US simply has the economies of scale to be able to afford these big investments. So the state must regulate, control, lean against the irrational exuberance and cycles of finance. It must provide basic social welfare nets, and it also still has a role in that fundamental baseload of science, which is crucial to the technological progress which can take us further down this extraordinary path of the last 200 years breakthrough.
I think before you came, we all knew that we lived in very complex and challenging times. I think you've explained to us very well why they're so complex and so challenging. And now all we are looking forward to is to see your book so they can buy it immediately when it comes out. So thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Adair.
The Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy.